I'm really excited about this panel simply because, as Caroline said, security seems to be the #1 concern when it comes to cloud adoption and just shifting your workloads to the cloud. So let me introduce my panelists. To my left is Lena Smart. She's the CISO of MongoDB. John Stewart, he's the Chief Security and Trust Officer for Cisco. And Suresh Vasudevan, he's the CEO of Sysdig. So let me start off with you, John. I mean, we kind of gathered from the presentations since the morning that cloud is an established market, and about 20% of the workloads have now moved to the cloud. So what does this mean for security? Because there is an architectural shift that's going on. We are in the middle of it. How do you see it from your lens?
Well, most security teams weren't ready. In fact, if you ever want to know what's going to happen technologically in the industry, ask the security team and they'll tell you that's never going to happen, which usually means it's exactly what's going to happen. That was BYOD, that was to the cloud, all the aspects of it. So it means a few things. First is that you end up having to bring new communities in as a security professional that may or may not have been ones that you worked with before. Sourcing, the legal team, you have to write things like master data protection agreements between vendors and yourself. You end up losing some visibility, but yet you're still accountable because your brand is still the one that's on the newspaper if something goes wrong. And you have to have a constant conversation with any provider that's providing service to you that they're ready to handle an incident when it happens. And to give you a sense of how frequently incidents happen, one happened to a Cisco vendor this morning. So at approximately 4:30 this morning, I learned of a malware attack against one of our vendors, and they end up having a set of responsibilities to us so that we now know what is going on with them transparently. You will find many vendors actually fighting this, saying, no, that's not how we're going to be transparent with you. We want to keep it private. We'll manage it. We'll let you know. Don't let them. But do not deny the notion that, as we've seen it now, over half the businesses in the world, by Cisco's count, have gone to hybrid to multi-cloud strategies, and well over 25%. In fact, we see it as about 40 to 45% of the enterprise-based workloads are actually cloud-based now, and the stats are heading that direction aggressively.
Okay, great. And Suresh, just to kind of go a little bit deeper, whose job it is to secure the data in the applications that are being deployed on the cloud? I mean, we have SaaS vendors that are kind of taking the ownership. You have companies that are migrating their own workloads to the cloud. Mm-hmm. Whose job it is when it comes to securing the data?
Yeah, so I think one of the first things to realize about moving to the cloud is that most of the shift is towards software. Increasingly, your application developers are accessing resources, accessing other services through APIs. And so probably the single biggest imperative is to start moving security more towards the development function, more embedding security into DevOps. How do you make sure that before you deploy software in the cloud, that it's scanned, free of vulnerabilities, that it's sort of compliant in its configurations and so on? It's really hard for a security team sitting outside to do that without having all the context that application developers have. And so moving security upstream towards development, embedding it into DevOps is, I think, one big priority. The second thing that I think is happening faster than we realize is the most fundamental building block of the cloud itself is changing. For 2 decades, VMs have been the underpinning of how we've performed compute, and containerization, as we move towards containerized services, containerized applications, is starting to happen at a very rapid clip. In fact, some of the services you're deploying in the form of Confluent or other software that we heard about earlier are becoming containerized themselves, right? And so while this is good for many reasons, the fundamental truth about containers is that traditional security tools are blind to containers. Network traffic doesn't even go through a firewall anymore, so how do I prevent sort of one service from talking to another service and so on? So starting to get ahead of container security, adopting tools that are container native starts to become another huge change, I think. And more broadly, this also forces you to move towards DevOps and developers, I think.
Got it. And I'm going to come back to firewalls, but before that, Lena, there have been a lot of cyber attacks where the problem have been the people. It's related to compliance, it's related to just kind of people not acting in the best possible way when it comes to, being kind of compliant with the standards and, just a lack of, I guess, vigilance on their part. So how do you see a company like MongoDB helping out in those sort of situations when it comes to privacy, compliance in general?
So I think your employees are your strongest link and your weakest link. Someone mentioned earlier that robots won't be taking over the world anytime soon. Sometimes it'd be easier if they did. So I think in terms of where we are at MongoDB, we make sure that our employees have a stake in security. I set up a security champion program. We have over 40 volunteers for that globally. And we have movie nights, and we're doing training specifically for cybersecurity for these individuals. And it gives them skin in the game. They're now the evangelist for security within their team. They can come back to me. You were saying earlier, embedding security early in the SDLC. We have developers on it. We have UI experts. It's not just the security people who are interested in security anymore. It's a lot of different people. And so we get a lot of different ideas that we wouldn't normally hear. I think sometimes security people live in this wee bubble. You might share information with other security people, but you don't really get to hear what's going on in the underbelly of the company.
Is there a security use case for a company like MongoDB when it comes to companies using their databases? How do you kind of pivot to security when you go out to your prospective customers?
Well, obviously security is very high on our list. One of the reasons I was employed by MongoDB was to, kind of move us into a more focused effort for security. And our customer data is obviously paramount to us as well. So we make sure that when we talk to prospects, we talk to new clients and existing clients, we get a really clear idea of the data that they have that they want to place either on-prem or in the cloud. We offer several different options. And the people within MongoDB that have access to that data are extremely limited and very heavily monitored and very secure.
Okay, great. So coming back to, measuring the efficacy of security products, and Suresh, you touched on the fact that containers data isn't going through the firewall. So maybe, John, you can talk about how relevant do you think firewall will be going forward as we, shift the workload postures to the cloud? Do you think firewalls will be relevant 5 or 10 years down the line?
Yeah, nothing like talking about half the business Cisco does in security and saying, yeah, it's irrelevant. Actually,
that was meant to be an example.
A couple things I actually realized we probably all haven't said yet. So cloud is not one conversation. There's infrastructure as a service that you're subscribing to, like AWS, GCP, Azure. There's actual application services you're subscribing to, which would be any number of the cloud providers, including some of the work that any one of our companies do. And then there's this notion of actually using it as your next-gen data center completely, which is you're migrating all your application workloads and infrastructure over. So decomposing that a little bit becomes important because if you've moved essentially what you consider your application services edge to something that's not in your data center, then the security controls are moving with it. And so what we traditionally call firewalling of today, which was allegedly the single point of entry into your business and it's the internet-facing infrastructure, is kind of just moving over to that other place. You'll notice that every application service company that you subscribe to, they're using firewalls to protect the services themselves. So it's become the data center edge versus, say, the company edge. And consequently, there's a different application or a different market for it that makes it relevant. They are virtualizing, so now it's a software instantiation of what typically was hardware. And in some cases, becoming highly microed. So you've got a very, very small footprint firewall, for lack of a better way to put it, because it's in front of each application workload, almost like paired with it one at a time. One of the more interesting developments in the last couple of years is watching AWS essentially build in security services you subscribe to as a result of being part of their infrastructure. And what they've essentially responded to is this notion that says, okay, firewalls are essentially now part of our world in AWS, and we end up having to be in front of the internet to the application and vice versa. So it's just moving, and it's changing form factors considerably. And in all candor, it's also getting a little bit more complicated because for the most part, firewalls weren't originally designed to handle application knowledge. They were almost an objective third party, but had no context. Context is going to be a word I think you and I are,
Indeed.
and Lena are probably going to be using all this time. And so now they're having to be quote unquote application aware. The world called this originally next generation firewalling. We also called it web application firewalling at one point. And all total, the knowledge is getting closer and closer and closer to having to have the service called security, whatever we want to call it, have an idea of what's actually happening. So it knows what's good, what's bad, what's actually supposed to happen, what's not, and then handle some of the changes that have to happen dynamically.
Got it. This is a good time to take our poll. So question is, what is your biggest security concern? First option is how much to spend on a cybersecurity program. Second, having the skills in-house to address risk. Third one is tracking information leaving the organization. And the fourth one is moving infrastructure to cloud.
And there isn't a fifth one, which is all of the above.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that would have been the easy option. So looks like it's the
Where's it coming out?
So by tracking information,
tracking information leaving the organization.
Do you
So-
mean leaving my premise to go to the cloud or leaving the cloud?
Data leak.
Okay.
Going outside of what we control.
Okay.
The cloud itself.
Yeah, just and it goes back to what we were talking about, employees being the weak link and kind of
Well,
not
because you
being
can get the
vigilant.
guy with the USB drive and he can take your entire sales link as well, and there's nothing to do with the cloud at that point.
Right.
So
How did you all interpret the question? Is it the data you used to have in your IT systems being in somebody else's systems legitimately, or was it the remote
Someone
IT
stealing it.
system, cloud system lost control of that data? Which way were you thinking of the question? Lost control kind of question? Is that fairly consistent on how you guys thought the question was?
That's what the poll results show. So I guess, Suresh, let me come back to containers. So you said, obviously, you've seen rapid adoption of containers, and a lot of the development on the cloud is open source. So I don't think people in this room are very comfortable. I mean, yes, there are certain open source technologies that every company uses, but naturally, open source kind of raises some alarm bells. So do you think the use of more open source makes companies more vulnerable when it comes to the new type of attacks, or do you think there is a remedy out there?
Yeah, so I think I'll start by first saying that the premise of moving to the cloud has already baked in the premise that you are using an enormous amount of open source, whether you know it or not. The cloud is largely built on an open source foundation, notwithstanding licensing challenges back and forth. It's pretty much sort of built on open source foundations. And I would argue that asking an individual company to figure out how to secure itself is akin to asking every company to mount a missile defense system on their roof and say protect against every attack, right? And so I would argue that security is in some ways odd in that there's been very little impact of open source on security. There are open source success stories, billion-dollar companies in almost every other segment of technology, but not yet in security. And that's changing, partly driven by the cloud. I'll give you an example. One of the threat detection projects we use as a foundation for our product in container security is an open source project. One of our customers basically used that open source to create rules around how to recognize when hijackers use your resource for crypto mining. And they open source the entire set of rules. Now, that is a concern that cuts across industry, cuts across companies. And so the more that you're able to leverage community-sourced policies, especially when the cloud is all about configuration, security, making sure your APIs are secure, making sure your configurations are secure, having community contributions that protect an elastic configuration, an S3 bucket configuration, a Mongo configuration, would be better than each company reinventing policies over and over again. So I actually think open source is a strength to be leveraged in security rather than something to sort of worry about, because it's already there in your organization today.
Got it. And so, Lena, we heard AI and machine learning quite a bit in the earlier panels, and the basis for that is, collecting more data and to be able to harness it to predict, kind of preventing new attacks or to be able to predict behaviors. Is that something you find your clients using, MongoDB more and more, where they would use the data and the analytics that you have and try to apply machine learning for behavior assessment and stuff like that?
I think there's a lot of customers looking into that. I think it's still a wee bit buzzword bingo-ish, if you like. There's a lot of people who would like to have this huge data lake, and somehow they're going to predict what's going to happen, in the next 5 minutes or 5 years. Or I think it's an important thing to look at. I just wouldn't put all my eggs in that basket at the moment.
Okay, and so what else can, or at least financial services are notorious when it comes to security, and your clients are a lot of financial services companies. How else are they, implementing security solutions when it comes to just protecting data?
How are our customers?
Yeah.
That's up to them, really.
So they don't work with you in terms of, okay, you are the database provider.
Yeah, no, we
And-
work with them
yeah.
specifically on how to secure the data that's in our databases. They're not going to tell me how they're going to secure everything on their premise or in the cloud, but we will work with them, obviously, when it comes to MongoDB data, people who have access to that data, the employees of both companies and stuff like
So
that.
they are implementing their own security policies?
By and large, yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
got it.
if you use Atlas out of the box, it is secure out of the box.
Yeah.
But to your point with sharing, rules bases and things like that, I think that's a great idea.
Okay. And so, John, I guess it would be interesting for everybody to hear from your perspective, given the broad enterprise customer base Cisco has, does cloud actually helps organizations respond faster to cyber breaches? Like, does it give them the agility to, okay, detect a breach first and then respond to it?
So I think there's a rational argument to be made, which covers a lot of the questions actually all in one, which it sort of starts as follows. There used to be a single data center, and that's where the attackers would go because that was the only place that anything mattered. Now there's diversity of where your services are, and it's changed whether or not that's faster or slower to respond. And I think I could argue both sides of the argument. What I would suggest to you, though, is that one of the more fascinating aspects about subscribing to cloud as a capability is that there's a huge incentive economically for the provider of service to you to do it right. Ironically, that's not technically as deep for the IT team. I mean, it's sort of an unspoken truth, but it's kind of generally true, which is IT teams are highly responsible for keeping things running. And in fact, we'll go to that mode almost instantly because that's most of the rewards mechanisms. So to my eye, if you find or I should say create a problem, you can fix it faster with sort of the DevOps model because you can release every 60 seconds, every 6 minutes, every 60 minutes as you need to, number one. And then number two, in the subscribe part of it where you're actually buying service, they're heavily incented to do it extremely well. And they're doing it for a single app. Your IT teams, you know this better than I do, but most of our customers are managing many application suites on infrastructure that's many different types of infrastructure. That means there's a diversity dilemma of having to know all of it simultaneously. A single purpose built for service that you're subscribed to is only going to do that really well. MongoDB is only going to be doing what they know how to do really well because it's the only thing that they're supposed to be doing. They don't have this other set of things they have to manage that are so diverse. So I think the high side of this is that they're going to be well attuned to exactly what they need to do architecturally in order to protect data, in order to provide service, et cetera. Whereas if we tried to do it, if we're running Oracle databases, for example, internally, we'd have to know Oracle, we'd have to know all the application suites on top of it, we have to know the data paths, we have to know the storage systems, we have to know the network, we have to know the compute side, and that's essentially what history has been for most IT teams. So there's an upside to all of this, which is that in my estimation, speed to remediation is actually accelerated inside of cloud services for that very reason. Second piece of this that I'll only suggest on the infrastructure side, things like Kubernetes and the way the orchestration layers are doing virtualized containers and VMs and beyond, typically are increasing the consistency of implementations because it's a punch once, works everywhere kind of mode, which in and of itself is very, very helpful for speed to remediation, because you're not dealing with variability across the systems as much. So there's actually very much what I would call traditional high sides on speed.
And just to piggyback on that, Suresh, so how are organizations kind of carrying forward their security postures and policies for new containerized workloads that are, I guess, born in the cloud?
I actually do agree very much with what you said. So I'll start by just saying, if I look at the organizational model that we are seeing with most companies that are moving workloads to the cloud, the ones that are able to scale past a certain point, where they've gone past the first half a dozen workloads moving and so on into it, whether it's containerized Kubernetes orchestrated workloads or just moving to the cloud without necessarily adopting containers. Generally speaking, it starts with a platform engineering team or a cloud platform team rather than the existing network storage distributed teams, right? When that tends to happen, what we are increasingly seeing is that security is actually part of that team, rather than security coming in after the fact. The budget may live in the security side, sometimes it lives on the platform engineering side. We're actually seeing that anyone that's gone to a certain degree of scale embeds security into the cloud platform team or the platform engineering team, and that tends to be a template for success. I also believe that as much as the role changes quite a bit, both detection and remediation are faster. It's just that the tools you need are different, right? And so it's not configuring the 1,000 firewall rules anymore. It's about saying, how do I apply policy? So it's more declarative rather than sort of actually configuring rule by rule. It's declarative that says, I want to detect these services and not let them talk to some other service. And the actual mechanism of how it's implemented is left to orchestrators like Kubernetes. So it's a change, but the change definitely improves your security stance. It's just that we are in the learning phase. Kubernetes is still, most of the time, a pain to get right, and so we're still in the mode where we're just learning to get how to get that right.
Got it. And Lena, I guess when I look at the different options that are available on the cloud for companies, and a lot of the software vendors are using hyperscale cloud providers. Is that the approach, for somebody like MongoDB as well, that they feel more comfortable using public cloud providers for deploying workloads, or they? Do they view it more secure than doing it in their own data center when it comes to customer deployments, or you think?
So do our customers think the cloud is more secure?
Yeah.
I think that's where they're going. That's where a lot of our revenue has been generated from, is our Atlas-based platform. I think to the gentleman's points, I think it's much easier to scale, obviously. It's easier to secure, I think, just because of speed to market, how quickly you can spin up new instances and get going, get your business going very quickly. So yeah.
So are you migrating your existing customers to public cloud as well?
There's a lot of customers who are moving from on-prem to
And what does the
cloud.
migration process look like?
It's as seamless as we can make it for
Like,
them.
how can you give us a sense of the timeline? How long does it take to?
It would depend how big their on-prem solution is, what they're actually doing. Do they want to split it? Do they want to remain half on-prem, half on cloud? It's a complete. There's a lot of architectural freedom, but I couldn't give you a time on how to get there.
But security doesn't come up as a concern when it comes to those migrations.
It's a concern, but we have alleviated a lot of those concerns just with our architecture and how we're selling the product.
Okay, we're almost out of time, so maybe for the last question, John, what do you think the security landscape is going to look like, given that we all agree that cloud transition is going to accelerate, and companies are comfortable moving their workloads? So what are we talking about in the next 3 years in terms of a security landscape?
I think that this whole cyber thing might be big. So I see sort of 6 big influences, and I've published a little bit of this in my crystal ball, which, by the way, I bought at Walmart, so you know how precise it's going to be from here. But my estimation is we're going to have economic turbulence, so that's going to affect IT budgets, which is going to affect security budgets, which is going to affect business budgets. You all can see that coming. And that in and of itself creates some very tense dynamics inside of deployment, but what it also tends to do is force technological evolution, because you're typically having to reduce OpEx burn with some sort of service capability. There's the geopolitical discussions of tensions between countries, that increases the hostility to people and companies and all of the people that are on the internet. That seems to be rising with a separatist structure to it for the most part. So the tensions between countries are going up, which typically means all of us are caught a bit in the crosshairs of that stuff. Governments are absolutely engaging and exerting their position. I would suggest to you that from my experience in traveling, which I do a considerable amount of working with governments of our customers, the answer is we believe that the market has failed to self-manage the issues and risk, and so we are jumping in. EU did it with GDPR. Australians actually just upped the penalty at 10 million Aussie dollars to 10% of total revenue, depending on which one's the bigger of the two, because it's considered a pressure wave by which to exert back to the executives you all included, get on it, because we don't believe that you just said don't regulate us and now we're getting in it because it still seems to be going wrong, and so we're going to change our modality here. So that's altering the world. Talent supply, big surprise, that's a considerable problem. North of 4 million all the way up to 7 million by some estimations of job openings in this field that have no people yet in order to fill them. And then you start to see penalties. And the penalties is somewhat related to the regulatory side, but it's the penalty of doing something wrong. Civil, criminal, and certainly regulatory have all joined the fray. And as you might imagine, the final one is just the fact that it is still an incredibly profitable industry for the other side. And that is not by any stretch of the imagination going away, and nor do I think that it will. The piece about cloud, though, just please embrace this notion of cloud versus fear it, because I actually conclude it's inevitable, and candidly, especially at the infrastructure as a service level, I think it is non-differentiating to run compute now. It's needed, but it's non-differentiating except in very, very specific circumstances. So why actually spend time of your OpEx dollars doing that when service delivery on top of it is in fact where you're going to monetize for the most part in your businesses anyway. You will, however, see two resistors, the security team and the IT teams, because we're actually getting displaced and confused during all of it. So just be prepared to dig in and help that transition because it's so comfortable.
Really quick, Suresh, any notable predictions from your side when it comes to changing security posture?
Yeah, no, I would. The obvious one is every month there's a 20 million breach, a 30 million breach. I don't think that's going to stop anytime soon. The second comment I'd make is I agree completely. Cloud adoption is going to grow. I think the two biggest changes I believe we'll see are in the organizational structure of security teams within most companies. In order to drive cloud adoption, you're going to have to think of security as a policy organization, and then implementation will start moving up into DevOps. From the point of view of the vendor landscape, I believe that sort of people that are not focused on cloud security, the largest security companies will have moved their portfolio quite significantly to talking about how they're addressing deployments in the cloud versus securing perimeter or on-prem, right? And so some of the largest security vendors will now come from the cloud side rather than from the traditional side.
And Lena, same thing from you.
I think we're going to see, to John's point, more regulation, more fines. CPA is coming down the pike. I think it's just going to cost us a lot more to be more secure.
Great.